One, two, three, four.
Hello, my name is Erin Stroud, and I will be the host of our very exciting new podcast series titled Starting in Science. The purpose of this series is to serve as a crash course on how to become a scientist in New Zealand. We'll be covering everything from making the decision that science is going to be the career for you, through to what being a scientist actually looks like on a day-to-day basis, and how to land that dream job. And look, take it from me, the pathway into science can be a little tricky to navigate. So I'm taking it upon myself to ask scientists the big questions and make the journey into a science career a little less confusing and a lot more achievable. So this is the first episode in the series, which is basically a beginner's guide to a career in science. We're going to be chatting about what it takes to be a scientist, what you can do at high school to set yourself up for a career in science, and how to navigate the tertiary education system and beyond. Now, as a true sign of the times, we're recording this episode from home, so please bear with us if the audio quality isn't quite at our usually exceptional standard. So today I'm joined by two very qualified individuals and one semi-qualified co-host who are going to help us untangle this pathway into science. So I'm going to get us all to introduce ourselves by letting you know who we are, what our roles are, and why we wanted to get into science. So I'll kick off. My name is Erin Stroud. I'm a PhD student here at Plant and Food Research, but I'm also part of the joint graduate school with the University of Auckland, which I'm sure Jo will touch on shortly. Instead of telling you why I wanted to get into science, I'm going to tell you why I wanted to do this podcast series. And basically the reason is that I found it incredibly difficult to navigate the pathway into science. When I decided that I wanted to get into science, I had no idea what the next steps were. So rather than letting you struggle through navigating that pathway, this podcast is going to serve as a platform to help you make those steps yourself. So with that being said, Jo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Jo Putterill, and I'm a professor in the School of Biological Sciences and director of this joint graduate school in plant and food science that Erin was talking about. And this gives students an opportunity to work at plant and food research sites throughout the country and do a more industry-focused type of research project. So there'll probably be a chance to talk a little bit more about that later. Why did I get into science? I was very interested in providing food for the world many years ago when I first started, and I thought I would do horticultural science, in fact. Then, because I had pretty good marks at school, I was encouraged to do a more academic degree, a BSc first, and then with the idea that I'd go off and do horticulture. But in stage one, I got fascinated with genetics, and I never made it to my postgraduate horticulture diploma, and I ended up staying at the university and eventually getting my PhD, and now I'm a professor in plant molecular genetics because that has remained a kind of fascination with me. But I did get into horticulture with the family and helped set up and run a kiwi fruit orchard for a few years. So I did the horticulture as a hobby in the end. And now very closely interacting with plant and food in the kiwi fruit area. So yeah, that's enough about me probably.
Cool. Richard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kia ora koutou. I'm the chief scientist for plant and food research, and I've worked in plant and food and its predecessors since 1996. But along the way, I've actually had fractional appointments. So I've had joint appointments with the University of Auckland too. So I've had a crack at lecturing students and sort of working in the university environment as well as the research institute environment. So how did I get into science? That's a really good question. I think I didn't really think I had a choice. I was a bit of a nerd when I was young. I think my parents recognized that. They bought me a microscope. They had to put up with the fact that I always was really curious about the world and would bring insects into my bedroom and had little insects all over the place and working out how they sort of plotted their way in the world. So I was really just, the curiosity thing got me, and I just kept going and found myself at university doing science subjects and then just kept going and going. And yeah, it wasn't straightforward. There wasn't a kind of guidebook in terms of how do you get a career in science. there's no such book, and there are multiple pathways to do it that no one really tells you about. And certainly when I was there, I just sort of followed my nose, so to speak, but to the point where I actually now work on smell and olfaction. So I really did literally follow my nose, and that's kind of been where I ended up. But it was never really that purposeful. I just sort of put one foot in front of the other and sort of ended up, and here I am today.
Funny how many people's science careers start with looking at insects in their backyards and annoying their parents. Jay, how did your story into science start, and who are you and why are you here?
Yeah, kia ora tātou, mystery semi-qualified co-host, I suppose. Hello, everyone. My name is Jayaraman, co-host SIS podcast. I suppose I'm here because I'm the bridge between where Erin is in her career and where, Jo and Richard are in their careers. You guys are very qualified, have a storied career in science. I'm sort of just starting out, like what you'd call an early career researcher, or ECR. I'm still qualified as an ECR. So just over 4 years post PhD. So most scientists, sort of go through the whole process of entering science and then finding their way to a PhD, a project that really, excites them. And so 4 years post, I'm still working on the same thing. But like most scientists, I started out, in the academic side at universities and this sort of thing. I did an undergraduate and postgraduate career. Not just in New Zealand, I did it in Australia and in Korea, South Korea as well. And then I transitioned to my first postdoc position, like first post-PhD position at Planet Food. So it was a strange transition from going from a university environment to an industry environment where the mechanics of it is very different. And so I don't know. I mean, it's twists and turns. I'm really glad to be able to talk about this, because there's many weird things in science that we don't talk about, the personal aspects of it. And I'm really excited. Thank you, Erin, for having me along on this journey. Let's go.
Good to have you. So I guess what we're kind of stumbling on is that there's many pathways into science, and that people might decide that they want to get into science for lots of different reasons. So I guess if you are at the very beginning of your science career, and I mean the very beginning when you're just deciding that maybe you want to be a scientist, what are some sort of personality traits or things that you might be good at, or things that you might be really interested in that would make you a good scientist, I guess? So Richard, what is some traits that you think would make a good scientist?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned one before, which was that sort of curiosity about the world. I think that's a real driver. If you find yourself wondering how the world got to be the way it is, or how the world works that way, whether it be in biology or physics or anything, or why the stars are there, or how does that work, then that's a really big driver. I mean, I think most successful scientists are really just curious about the world. They want to understand how it works. Another big driver for researchers and scientists is they want to make the world a better place. So, and that's a big driver for me as well. So it's linking those two things together. You're curious about the world, but you also want to maybe affect change that will make it a better place for humans, but also for all biodiversity, the planet. It's just that you want to create knowledge and affect change. And thirdly, another kind of skill set or something you might want to recognize in yourself that might mean you might be good at science is that maybe you've got a bit of an eye for detail. Maybe you're a little bit meticulous. Maybe you really like detail, because scientists tend to have to be pretty good at the detail. They need to be careful with what they're doing. In experiments, you need to be careful. You need to be meticulous, because that's where the insights come from, setting those experiments up really well, and so that you can then analyze the results and create new knowledge, or create that change that will make the world a better place.
Yeah, Richard, that sounds like you're saying that you both need a nose, an eye, and a heart for science.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Really well put, Jay.
Yeah, we could change the name of this podcast series to The Anatomy of a Scientist.
And I guess the cool thing about deciding that you want to get into science is that it can kind of come at any point in your life, right? You don't have to be a kid messing around in your backyard looking at ladybugs like I was. That made me realize that science might be the thing for me. But you could also be halfway through a career in business and just decide that actually I really like to think about the way that the world works. And maybe I planned to go into horticulture, and then instead I decided to pivot and do something a little bit different. So I think it's quite normal for people to decide to come into science at different stages. Would you agree, Jo?
Yes, I think so. One does, in the university, I sometimes see people who've actually studied medicine and then end up becoming physician scientists and doing extremely well as they pivot back, if you like, from their medicine, not back necessarily, but I guess back into the academic sense. And, they do very well in health research groups and things. So, yeah, you certainly can. I think at a certain point, if you want to be a full-on research scientist, if you make that choice to go into science quite late in your career, then it can be quite hard to develop the strategies for funding your research and for perhaps having enough sort of publications and things and track record to really get a research career going very late in life. But that doesn't stop you studying science and doing something that's science related. And that could be teaching science, being involved in researching. It might be involved in administering science, managing science, compliance, etc. Those are big employers in New Zealand. So there are different flavors of science too, as opposed to just being a pure researcher.
Yeah, absolutely. I always find it really interesting how many people sort of go to university to study medicine and then come back into a more science-based role. So what do you think it is about, a career in science that brings people in? What are the good parts about being a scientist? Jay, do you have any suggestions?
Well, so, it's interesting. We've now landed on medicine. The reason why I am in science, my parents insisted that I be a medical doctor, so, it's just sometimes you get pushed into it and other times it finds you. And so the career that I'm in right now, it found me because I started off doing medicine. I entered medical school in Australia. In the very first class, in my anatomy class, I ended up just collapsing on the ground. I fainted after viewing, body parts. And so, sometimes science is not quite, the science that you're in is not quite for you. Listen to the signs. Gravity is a great indicator, it pulls you down. Yeah, and so I went into biotechnology and then you meander your way through. But I did realize from when I was very young that I was very passionate about science. And so I guess one thing that I kept looking for as I meandered through my journey was when I felt that spark again, that childlike interest in the things that I was doing, like that passion. And I think that served me really well. Obviously, I'm speaking from a privileged position. I had parents that were able to support me through whatever crazy decisions that I made. I got a job immediately after my biotech degree, didn't like it, and it promptly quit. And my parents were super pissed about it. They were like, what the heck are you doing? You're going to throw away your career. And it turns out it was the right decision. And they weren't happy I didn't do medicine. They weren't happy that I quit. But, ended up getting my PhD and the PhD title, and that kind of made them a little bit satisfied. So yeah, it's weird ways to get into it. Every way is the right way.
So following your sort of natural interest and things that you're passionate about was a highlight in a career for science for you. Yeah. What about you, Richard? Were there any sort of key highlights for having a career in science that you have found along the way?
There's nothing like the buzz of discovery when you actually work out that you've found something that no one's ever found out before. That's a real buzz. That really hooked me on. That was, I think, the first time I really got that buzz was during my PhD, and that's hooked me ever since. I've been hooked on discoveries. As my career progressed, I got also more interested in the application part and it making a difference. And so getting a buzz out of the fact not only can I make a discovery, but that discovery might lead to making a product or making the world a better place in some way. My PhD work was on discovering how insects became resistant to insecticides. But then later on, that sort of led to the development of bioremediation agents that broke down pesticides in the environment. And it's that kind of thing that, you know, in the latter years of my career has sort of really given me a buzz looking at the application part.
Yeah, there's a real thrill about being sort of on the edge of what's known and not known every day in your working career. How many people can say that that's what they do every day? How cool. And I guess, Jo, that kind of sounds like what got you into science as well, the want or the desire to help feed the population. It's contributing to,
that's right.
The world.
Make a difference. And I think in terms of what I enjoy too, I'm quite scholarly, so I like and I guess I was always told by my PhD supervisor, you've got to get it as right as possible. So it's that truth seeking, which is kind of back to those hallmarks, things that you were talking about, traits of being a good scientist. So get it right, or get it as right as you can, was what he always sort of hammered to me. And so I guess it's about questioning, it's about testing and analysing, and then having the capacity to say, what does it all mean? And I guess we're hearing a lot about this now with, evidence-based decision-making from the government in the last couple of years for COVID. So it's, it's trying to build that or develop that capacity to then take all these results, say what the implications are, and then come up with the next step in your science or the next step in your policy or whatever it is. I think I enjoy that whole process.
I'm going to throw another one out there as well, that one of my favorite things about starting my career in science has been surrounded by people that are equally nerdy and passionate and, driving to do these cool things in the field that I want to as well. And it, really feed off that energy around you, and it's super cool. But, in saying that, like all career paths, there's some not so cool things about science. We're not going to sugarcoat that science is the best career in the world. There are some negatives. So I know, Jay, you've got maybe a few things to add to this point.
Absolutely. If you're chasing the dollars, science is not necessarily the career for you. It's a passion-driven project. I like to think of it like, as Richard did say, pointed out it's either by hook or by crook. So either you find your hook, or you try and fix all the crook people that are out there in medicine. So that's the science sector in New Zealand summarized in my mind. And so, you do it for the people, you do it for, your community, you do it for discovery. Not too much money in there. I mean, you'll get paid well if you can find a job. That's another downside, is that jobs are rare. It's a small economy, a small country in New Zealand. And so, you have to really, really want to do the things that you're doing. And that's where, obviously I'm talking from a passion project angle, and so it drives me all the way, finding the right career, making the right decision. Erin, what are some negatives you see in science?
I see not a lot of work-life balance in some of my peers. I think the downside of having a passion-driven career is that sometimes people get a little bit too passionate about their careers and forget that they've got lives outside of work. But, that could be any job as well. I think there's pros and cons to every job. I wonder, Richard, do you have any insights being in, the role that you're in, quite high up, if I might say?
Yeah, I think job security has, particularly in the past, I'd say less so now, been an issue in science in New Zealand, and especially in the research institutes. Hopefully that's changing. It's if you're, as you say, if you're after the money, it's not really a highly paid position. Another thing that sort of struck me was when I first came back from doing my PhD in Australia, I was sort of hired into one of these research institutes. It was Hawke Research at the time, predecessor of Plant and Food, and my boss said, "Oh, that's great. Well, you've got this job. Now you better sit down and write some grants, and because I don't have any funding for you." And I spent the next 5 years or so basically going from one postdoc fellowship to another, and then eventually got into some more grunty grants. But yeah, so no one really told me that I'd be spending most of my time applying for grants. Because English and writing weren't my fortes, they probably still aren't, but I spend most of my days now actually writing, which is kind of ironic because I got into science to do science, not necessarily to be an expert communicator. So that's kind of something else that was was not what I expected when I got into science.
But then, you could exercise your inner storyteller then. And like the more you exercise it, the better you get at telling stories about, the science that you're interested in, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. And to be honest, the more writing you do, the easier it comes. It now comes pretty easily now. But it was just that kind of expectation thing that you never think when you go into something like science, you'll actually become just because of what you need to do in terms of funding, you'll actually become quite a good communicator. And I think that's becoming increasingly important too for science. It's not just about we need to tell our stories. So that's why I'm really stoked that you asked me to be on the podcast, because I think telling our stories is really, really important, not just our personal stories, but our science stories as well.
Yeah, I guess pivoting off that point, Richard, if people are listening to this podcast and they are at high school, maybe even younger, if you're really up to the game. If you're going through high school at the moment, what sort of courses or classes or things do you think would be really important for people to take? Like, what can people do now to set themselves up properly for a career in science? So you're kind of hinting that maybe taking English and some creative writing papers might be handy to take. Is there anything else that you can think of that might be handy to throw into the mix?
Sure. I mean, besides the obvious, the science subjects and, physics and chemistry and biology, whatever interests you. Yeah, I think, not forgetting English would be a good thing. The other thing I'd really recommend, and I recommend to all my graduate students too, and any students, is that increasingly we're doing more and more of our science in silico or on computers. So ability to code is becoming really important. We can ask questions and do experiments without having to leave our desk, at least initially. So yeah, the ability to code, I think, is going to become increasingly important.
And as someone who's placed at the university at the moment, Jo, when you're getting students coming through from high school, maybe into their first years of university, what sort of things do you think students should have done before they get to university that could set them up well?
Well, I think the key thing really is for the students and teachers at high school, and I think they do a lot of this very, very well now, is just to make sure they've actually worked out what subjects they need, and you need to do that at school. So you are right for your, if you do want to say get into health sciences or whatever, you do need to make sure that you've actually done the right subjects and you don't get caught out. But I think maths is definitely in the mix. You mentioned possibly computing and stats and so forth as well. So yeah, I think those are the key things that you need. But it's about knowing what's ahead of you. And the universities are quite good. If you go on the websites of the faculties, if you dig around in there, you will be able to find out eventually exactly what's required, and that's important to do.
What about you, Jay? Did you do anything particularly nerdy during high school to get yourself to where you wanted to be, apart from studying every day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't get to do a lot of science growing up in Fiji. There's really no science programs. I know in New Zealand, they have the Department of Conservation encourages engagement from high school students and other levels of students. And so, I would wholeheartedly recommend that, you get out into nature. It sort of brings it home to you as well, like why you're doing that science that you're doing. It's all about conservation and nature and biology, at least in my mind anyway. I'm biased. But I did a lot of accounting because my dad's an accountant. I worked in an accounting office. So mathematics came quite, wouldn't say easily, but there was a computer at work and I used that a lot. And so it came a little bit more naturally for me than a lot of my other colleagues growing up in Fiji. So, like you take a lot from the personal experiences that you have. You can set yourself up to, learn things a lot easier. But having said that, I think one of the more important things for me was to sort of keep in contact with why I was doing what I was doing, like keep the interests in mind. I know that we've sort of touched on very disgusting topics like math and stats and coding. And coding is pretty fun, I think. But, like play more video games, that's, there you go. Kids, scientists approve playing more video games, but more importantly, learning how those video games are made. That's really important. And like trying to understand the nitty gritty and the nuts and bolts about how things work. I think that will always serve you well. But thinking about the things that interest you and why you're interested in them will keep you motivated through all the math and stats classes, I think.
Richard, did you have a point to add to that?
Yeah, just some other ways that people that might be interested in science might like to interact with it while they're at school. Quite often the university and CRIs run open days. So if you see one pop up advertised, go along. And, there's other places as well that you might not think that there's a lot of science there, but actually there is quite a few bits of science going on. And museums are a good place. There's actually a lot of things to see about science, museums. There's even the observatory you can go to if you want to have a look at the stars. So there's lots of different places that you can engage with science and scientists that you might not have sort of immediately sprung to mind.
Yeah, I think hitting up your career advisor is also a good point of call as well. They are normally just absolutely thrilled to have anyone walk through their door, especially if you know what you want to do and they're not forcing you to be in there. So if you are at high school and you think, I want to get into science, maybe your career advisor could be a good point of call. But if you have gotten to the end of your high school career, or maybe you've gotten to the end of whatever career you're currently in and decide that you wanted to get into science, obviously one of the things that you have to do to get into science is you really have to go to university, don't you? You kind of have to go through the tertiary education system. So if that is what you wanted to do, where can we actually study science in New Zealand, Jo?
Well, you can study it at all the major universities. They all offer great science courses in the North and in the South Island. So there is no problem there at all. Auckland's Faculty of Science is probably the largest, with 10 departments ranging all the way from, physics and maths and biology through chemistry into psychology. So sort of social sciences as well. Getting into a BSc, Bachelor of Science, is the normal starting point, and we'll come back to that, I think, with the different courses and things.
We're very spoilt for choice here in New Zealand, aren't we? We've got quite a few universities that you can go to. And I guess if you are coming into the university system to study science in New Zealand, maybe you're coming from overseas, you might be an international student, probably not given the current climate. But Jay, you were an international student. Do you have any points that you could add to that and what you might need to know if you are an international student in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, I was an international student in 3 separate countries, first in Australia, then in New Zealand, then in South Korea, and then back in New Zealand. It's just every country has its own slightly varied system, but it is an international sort of degree. Science is a universal language, really. But one thing I really found, especially during my undergrad years in Australia and also doing some postgraduate work in New Zealand, is that the large number of choices that you have open to you is almost a detriment sometimes. You really worry about making the wrong choice. I know I certainly worried about it a lot and thinking, should I take this course? It's very similar to this other course. And I found that there wasn't a lot of guidance on what the right choice was. In retrospect, Jo, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this. It didn't matter too much. Obviously there are things like prerequisites, there are courses, that you have to take to enter other courses. So having that long-term view is important if you want to speed things up. But in retrospect, when you're doing science, you're kind of committing for your career, your lifestyle to change to be a scientist, right? So if you have to take an extra semester or if you take another couple extra classes to sort of learn the things that are interesting, it's a drop in the ocean of, the rest of your life in science, which is, an exciting prospect for most people. And so, take the time to do the things that you're interested in, but also do the things that you need to. But there isn't really a very wrong choice in that. So try not to stress about it is my general advice. I try and give myself for Jay in the past, chill out. It's going to be fine. Just try and do well at whatever you pick. That's pretty much generic advice. Yeah.
I think if you're an international student coming in, you again find out about the entry requirements. Usually the websites are pretty good on this. If you're coming from a country where you haven't studied in English, you will need to show the results of an English test. And that can be quite tricky. It's these IELTS or equivalent you've probably heard of. If you're coming into the PhD program, you might want to research the type of people in the department, contact them to see if they would like to supervise you. And so again, that's when having a strong record is important because that's your calling card. you might have started badly. We do have some students who have very poor initial records, but then they start showing that learning curve and they start getting better and better results. And so we're usually pretty happy to take that sort of person on as well. Yeah, and then it's expensive to live and work in New Zealand, so it's important again to get good results so that you can actually get a university scholarship or some kind of living scholarship, I think. At undergraduate, the domestic fees are not available to you as an international student, and so that's an extra very large cost too. So you've got to think about the financial aspects as well as the passion at this stage, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember that. Oh, it was very expensive studying in Australia when I was there. And so I was lucky enough that my dad was paying for all of my fees, but we had a deal in that, and Erin knows about this. So we had a deal that if I got anything less than an A in any of the papers, I'd have to pay for that myself out of pocket. I had a part-time job, and so I had to save up to pay for it. So I ended up saving up. But that really motivated me to do really well in my classes. I don't know if marks necessarily translate into being the best at that course, but it does translate into setting yourself for the right opportunities to prove that you're really good at that course. So if you do well in first year, second year biology, then you can get internships during the summer holidays, because those are really competitive and they pay you really well. So at the university level, different labs will advertise for students to come in and do a mini project, and that's when you actually experience what it's like being a scientist in a lab. You design a hypothesis with your supervisors and that sort of thing. And so I think it's really important to focus on the subjects that you're doing, get good marks so you set yourself up to have access to those labs. But yeah, it can be very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, navigating university is tricky already, and I'm sure navigating university as an international student is an extra layer of challenge on top of that. But one thing that you sort of picked out, Jay, was that there's a little bit of fear about picking the right courses when you're starting university. And we are going to break down what the different levels and different types of courses you can do at university, through from a certificate in science all the way through to a PhD. But when we're thinking about what you can learn at university, what sort of courses really are on offer, and what's the best strategy? Should we be taking a lot of really broad sort of topics, or should we narrow down on things that we're particularly interested in? Jo, did you have any advice for people that were at that stage?
Yeah, I think do things that interest you. So I think that's important, because we often end up, hopefully in life, having satisfying careers if we are doing things that we like. And so I think that's still very important. But probably I think the common thing at the moment, both in Australia and New Zealand, is that there's sort of BS, Bachelor of Science, for example, with majors and minors. And so you are picking sort of some topics of interest, and it's not just a wild smorgasbord of topics, but there's enough variety in there built in to allow you to have 2 or 3 interests going at the same time, especially when you first start off. I became very interested in genetics and cell biology almost immediately. And then sort of, I remember had to grind my way through stage 2 because there were none of those topics on offer and hanging out for stage 3, where I finally got to do all the things I really was excited by. So, you do have your own passions, of course. But another thing you can do, and I've actually had some very good students come through this pathway, is conjoins. So people have humanities and science, for example, or they'll do law and science, or they might do accounting and science. They're quite tough courses, but I've had some very good students, and they're often very good at writing as well, having gone through the more arts side of things. So they've been great for writing up their thesis. They haven't required any assistance at all, which is good for me. And then you can have, as I say, do the professional accredited things like medicine or engineering or whatever. And then sometimes people end up retrofitting back to being research scientists. So, even if you don't start out with a BSc, you can end up as a scientist, as we've already talked about.
Yeah, so we keep talking about a BSc, but people listening might not know what that is. So Jo, did you want to give us a quick overview of what the tertiary education system is? What kind of courses can we take? What do they mean? How long do they take? What do we get when we get them?
The common one to begin with is the Bachelor of Science, and that's usually 3 years. Then if you want to be a researcher, a number of universities are now offering these Bachelor of Advanced Science, which is a 4-year thing. And that's really is trying to tailor to people who might think they might want to be researchers. So a lot of people who do BSc are interested in science subjects rather than art subjects, but they don't necessarily want to become research scientists. They might be interested in doing something related to science, and that could be, becoming a teacher, being a science communicator, being an administrator of science, in some way compliance, as we've talked about, working at the border, in biosecurity, all sorts of different things. So a lot of BSc type graduates won't necessarily end up as researchers in labs. They'll be doing something related to their science training and pivoting off that with transferable skills, but it won't necessarily end up in a pure lab setting, I think. Once you start doing advanced science, Bachelor of Science with honours or Master MSc, Master of Science, that is giving you that experience in labs where, again, you're starting to have all of that sort of attention to detail that Richard was talking about, the answering a question, analysing and testing, interrogating it, getting it as right as possible, writing up a thesis. So you really are starting to perform like a scientist, an early career scientist at that point. And that then carries on. So those sort of 4-year degrees altogether, 3 years of BSc plus 1 year for honours, or plus 2 years for Masters of Science. Although now you can do a year and a half for the Master of Science. So there's variations on the theme of 1.5 to 2 years beyond the BSc. Does anyone want to say anything at that point?
I guess I just wanted to add that, you can cheat at every stage. There's like little, those internship programs that universities and labs have. Those are perfect cheating points. You can gain all of this experience and then you add it as an extra to your CV. And that's the leveling up that you really, really need. I mean, I definitely did that. When I was an undergrad, second year, I did an internship at the lab working on yeast. The lab smelled really good. I love that, baking bread, brewing beer kind of smell. And then I did it again at the end of my third year, oddly enough, in the same lab, even though most of my colleagues changed to other labs, which set me up for my honors, which was also in the same lab. I really realized I should change things up a little bit more. Anyway, but yeah, so you can cheat along the way is I guess my point. Cheat in inverted commas.
Yeah, and I guess it's as you go towards being a research scientist, if that's where you're heading, you are trying to do all these degrees, but then gain experience and have that not only for your CV, but for your ability to, get into a lab, get on with the team, problem solve, execute a plan, and all of those things, which is what you're going to need when you become a fully fledged scientist. So that's happening the whole time, I think. And the chances of getting jobs at the end of it are all magnified by the amount of experience that you have rather than just the degrees. So,
yes, one of the cool things about the way that the tertiary education system is set up for science is that it really is quite tiered, isn't it? And you can choose how far through the system you want to go depending on what you want the output to be. So maybe if I'm interested in science but I wanted to go into like policy or something, I'd stop at the end of my bachelor's. But if I decide actually I'm really interested in working in a lab that smells like yeast, I might continue to go through and go to a master's or above.
Yep.
So what's the final stage if you're really ambitious and you just can't get enough of university, Jo? Where would you end up?
Well, you do your PhD. So this is the Doctor of Philosophy. And that is 3 to 4 years. And this is where you really cut your teeth because it's still a supervised piece of work. But hopefully, by the end of it, you know more about the topic than your supervisor does. And maybe if you're doing it in New Zealand, you are the expert in New Zealand by the time you finish. So then, of course, it's not over yet. You then, if you want to become a fully fledged scientist, you will then usually go off and do a postdoctoral fellowship. And you might do one of those or two of those, and then be trying for the, a permanent position, which is what Jay did, I think. Is that right, Jay?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
So it really is like a ladder with many rungs, and you can jump on and get off when you want. And there's no real timeline either, is there? You can do a bachelor's degree and then maybe come back and do an honours or a master's later on. And it's sort of a really continual process that we can jump on and off as we go through our educational careers. How cool. So if you are going through the tertiary education system, what else could we be doing? So Jay's already touched on internships, but what about things like networking and getting to know people and experts in the field? And I mean, when we were at the University of Auckland and other universities in New Zealand, we're really spoilt for choice into making some of those contacts, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, with the joint graduate schools, that is a great opportunity for the sort of blending of experiences between the university and this, these fabulous Crown Research Institutes that are sort of spread throughout the country. And the one we're particularly involved with here is plant and food research. But the university also has links to, marine scientists as well in these kind of joint graduate schools, as well as land care, so more in the biosecurity area as well. So lots and lots of opportunities, I think, to gain experience, work in different labs, or in the field for that matter. Do summer studentships. There's a science scholars program as well, which I forgot to mention at Auckland Uni, which gives undergrads the chance to do research projects in labs. So yeah, lots and lots of opportunities now. And I think, as you say, the more you can get involved in organising seminars and conferences, blogging, etc., using social media, as you're doing, it all helps immensely, I think, to build up this sort of sense of what being a scientist is, and to get yourself known out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, just making yourself open to those opportunities. Hey, because I remember when I was in my third year of my bachelor's degree at university, there was a networking night with plant and food research, and I went to it and I just, name dropped all day, just went and talked to everyone that I thought looked important, said that I wanted to work at plant and food research, and that's kind of how I ended up here. So there's a lot of ways to kind of make those connections happen for you, aren't there? And I guess that's kind of the point that I wanted to end this little section on, Jo, is that I got to go to the plant and food research through the joint graduate school. So what are the benefits of the joint graduate school, and why should we kind of be taking part in it if we can?
Well, I think, as I say, some students really flower and blossom in the context of being, based in a Crown Research Institute like Plant and Food Research. So you can work as part of a bigger team with a set of professional scientists that is their main role, really, is to solve problems of importance for the country and provide solutions. So I think it really suits a lot of people very much. And often they do, in fact, just go on to work at Plant and Food or at one of the other CRIs. So I'm always very pleased when students that I am co-supervising, and it seems to have happened a lot lately, are hired at Plant and Food, for example, as research associates, if they've come out of their honours or masters, and others have been hired as scientists who've finished their PhDs, done a postdoc, and then have ended up at PFR, or were scientists indeed. So postdocs that I supervised over the years funded by Marsden grants, for example, have ended up working at Plant and Food. So yeah, it's great to see that progression into real jobs.
Yeah, actually, Richard, I wanted to sort of get your take on this. So we've sort of laid out the structure of, all these degrees that, the University of Auckland and the Joint Graduate School by proxy offers to students. At what stage can students then start transitioning over to somewhere like Plant and Food as part of this program? Like, so either for jobs or for placements at Plant and Food, where do you think a CRI like Plant and Food, fits into this model?
I'm just going to jump in quickly because a lot of people might not know what a CRI is. If you want to start there, Richard, could you explain to us what a CRI is? There's so many abbreviations going on today.
Sure.
Welcome to science.
Yeah, we love acronyms. CRI stands for Crown Research Institute. These are research institutes that are owned by the government and that are there to do research for the benefit of New Zealand, and there's a number of them set up to do research aimed at different sectors, whether they be primary sector, the environmental sectors. So they're all pointed in different ways, the industrial sector. So their primary purpose is to do research, whereas the difference for the university is that their primary focus is in teaching and training, but they also do research, mainly research for training. So that's kind of the difference. Where Crown Research Institutes, while we do have joint graduate schools and they do have students located in them, there's always through a university. We don't give out degrees and we don't have a teaching mandate. So we just have a research mandate. So that's the kind of difference. The other point I think I'd like to make is that we've kind of talked about all these different degrees, a BSc, an honours and a master's and a PhD. You don't have to go all the way. You can get off the conveyor belt at any point and get a job somewhere as a researcher. You can get a job working in a lab, even just with a BSc. You'll probably be doing the technical stuff and the detail work. But then you can get back on that conveyor belt if you want to, even if you have a job. Many of the research institutes, for instance, are quite happy to talk to you about whether you want to do more training. So you don't actually have to do it all in one go. It depends on your personality a little bit. If you really want to get into it and and get a job, then maybe get off it earlier, and you might want to get back on the conveyor belt later. But if you're one of those sort of people that thinks, well, if I get off the conveyor belt, I'll probably never get back on, maybe you should stay on it until the end of it then. I don't know. Interested to hear your thoughts on that, Erin and Jay. It's just, I just know plenty of examples where people have got off the conveyor belt and then got back on later.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely did that at least twice. So after I did my bachelor's degree with honors, I got a job working in a lab, a tissue culture lab. I was largely making media and doing like glassware work, just cleaning up and stuff. So like a technical level role. And I did it for a couple of months, and then I told you I quit. And the reason why I quit, and usually my marker for changing things drastically is boredom. So when I got bored of it really quick, I just decided to change. I quit, and my parents weren't happy, but it was the right call. And so, and then when I did my postgraduate diploma in New Zealand, I got a job as a research technician at Massey University. And again, I was doing that until I got bored. I did that for 2 years, and then I got bored, and I got back on the conveyor belt, as it were, to do my PhD. And so, as you say, you can sort of jump on and jump off as you see fit. And my jumping off point was always running out of money. And the jumping on point was always boredom. So it's really and because when you're working, you can save up enough to sort of tide you over a little bit more study, and that served me pretty well, I think. What about you, Erin? What do you think?
I've had the complete opposite experience, I guess.
I know.
I jumped on that conveyor belt and I've ridden it the whole way through. I really haven't taken time off. I've gone straight from Bachelor of Science all the way through to now doing my PhD, and largely that was due for very selfish reasons, in the sense that I wanted to be a really young doctor. So I'll be having the full qualifications quite early in my life, which is quite cool. Also, I really just am a self-professed nerd, and I love it, and I really enjoy the grind of academics. So I'm probably in the right place. I'm guessing that's what that means. But yeah, there's pros and cons to both, right? I've got very little money in my bank account because I've been a student for the last 7 years. So it depends what your priorities are. But if, someone like me now who's kind of near the end of my PhD, and I'm thinking that I will want to eventually be employed by someone and get some money that's not, a stipend, where in New Zealand can we get these jobs? We've talked about CRIs, these Crown Research Institutes, but what are they? What sort of ones do we have here in New Zealand, Richard?
Yeah, so there's the government-owned Crown Research Institutes. There are also other kinds of research institutes. There's the Cawthron that is focused on the marine environment. There are other privately owned research institutes, and there are industries that have their own research institutes as well. Fonterra has their own complete research institute in Palmerston North. You can work in industry. Increasingly, industry are investing in having their own researchers. You can work in government departments, you can work in councils. Auckland Council and a number of other councils employ researchers now. So don't just think that the only place you can work is either a government research institute or a university. There's lots and lots of different places where science is going on and where research is needed, especially in industry. It's really growing quite quickly. But I mean, if you are trying to get a job there, there's nothing like, if you really want to target somewhere you'd like to work, actually getting in touch with them, getting in touch with some key people in there and have a chat to them. They will have websites and advertise positions on their websites, but there's nothing like getting to know the people that are there and showing an interest. And of course, as Jo mentioned, these joint graduate schools are great places where you can actually get to know a place and decide whether you want to work there, but also for the employer to actually be there watching you and thinking, oh, that person's pretty good. That'd be great if we could employ them. And so, I mean, I think these joint graduate schools are working really well because of that. And we do take a lot of researchers straight out of these joint graduate schools. So that just proves that they're kind of working these relationships between the research institutes and universities. They're working really well.
Yeah. And then if none of that helps, which I'm sure it will, Seek is very good. So checking out the websites with jobs on them. I see there's one for the CRIs. There's 7 of these Crown Research Institutes, and they run a website for jobs within them. It's this kind of Science New Zealand careers sites. There's science and technology jobs within Seek, for example. So it gives you a good flavour, I think, of what's out there.
Yeah, I guess gone are the days where scientists were just huddled away in little dark labs somewhere and no one kind of knew what they were and what they were doing. Science is everywhere now, isn't it? There's so many different types of scientists, which is something that we'll be getting into further into this mini-series of this podcast. And I think it's really cool that that's the way the world is going now. And you can be very different types of scientists depending on what your passion is, and following your passion is kind of how you get into those things. But if we did want to be research scientists, which I'm sure quite a few people are quite interested in, did you want to just touch on the basics of how science is funded in New Zealand, Richard? Because I think this is an area that people are totally blindsided by when they come through the tertiary education system, and it sounds like you might have been yourself.
Yes, well, I mean, New Zealand does have quite a complicated funding system. It's probably too complicated to explain in this podcast, but I'll just say that it's complicated, and it's probably something that a researcher needs to learn about when they do get a job and get on board, because they'll be expected to know what all those opportunities are. The government is actually looking at having a bit of a rethink about the structure of our funding system. So hopefully in that they'll simplify it so that people like me don't have to spend hours explaining it to new researchers as they come on board. So that's hopefully going to happen. But I can say that the funding scene is changing, especially for plant and food and for many other places, in that historically the government was really the only funder of research. But increasingly we're seeing industry supporting research now. Government departments support research. And something that's changing for plant and food is that increasingly we are able to fund our own research now because we're earning royalties off our products. And so that's been a big change as well, because we have to decide where we would like to invest our own money as well. And of course, there's also philanthropic organisations are funding science because they want to change the world as well and make it a better place for the future. So it's a dynamic landscape, and there's more people interested in funding research now than there's ever been, because I think people are starting to see the benefits that science can bring to people and the world. So they want more of it.
I guess, yeah, it is a challenge to get funding for your research, but the cool thing is that when you do get that funding, you can do whatever you want. You can research your passion project until your heart's content, can't you?
Yeah, that's right. If you get funding support for your idea, whether it's a basic science idea and you've gone to the Marsden Fund to get some support for it, or you've gone to an industry partner and you say, I can fix this problem for you, and they give you support for that, you essentially are your own project manager, and you run that like a project and do the research and write it up, and you're accountable back to that funder to tell them what you did and how it worked out.
There's not many other jobs in the world that do that sort of work, are there?
No,
So
not at all.
kind of round us out, I guess, I'm putting you on the spot here, so please don't, hate me for this. But if you are sitting in your position now and you had to give advice to yourself beginning your pathway into science, what is the one piece of advice that you would give your younger self just before you're about to set out on this journey? And I'm going to put Jay on the spot first.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to what I said earlier. Definitely chill out. There's no rush. It's not a race to get to the job, get to the position. Take your time. The career of your dreams will find its way to you. You just have to be open to it, and you have to work hard. I know that I was raised to work hard and work efficiently, and that's never been an issue. And so I just needed to have more trust and sort of just enjoy the journey along the way. I think that'll be it. Yeah.
What about you, Jo?
Yeah, I think I have a habit probably of trying to take on too much and do too many diverse things. So I think stay focused would have been, or be a little bit more focused, would have been a good thing. And keep good notes. Do not rely on your memory to remind you what you did a few weeks ago in the lab. So I think I was bad at that when I first started out, but I've become much better as time's gone on.
It's a classic trap for newbies.
Yeah, yeah, it's a catch-22. You've got to remember to keep good notes, but then that crazy memory.
True.
What about you, Richard?
Oh, I'd really reinforce to myself, follow your passion. You can't go wrong if you follow your passion. It's going to keep you engaged. It's going to keep your mind on what's in front of you, because you're motivated because it's what you love doing. So yeah, just follow your passion as much as you can. And as Jay said, chill out a little bit and try not to fall into the trap of worrying about, am I going to get a job and all those things? Because if you're passionate, you'll succeed and be successful at what you're doing, and hopefully success will come to you rather than you trying to find success.
Yeah, all great points. I think if I could give myself, my past self, some advice on what I should have done better, is that recognizing that the pathway into science can be kind of tricky to navigate, and that it's actually not my job to figure out completely by myself. There's so many people that you can go to help for. The university's there to help you. Your colleagues and your peers are there to help you. You've got mentors left, right, and center. Everyone just wants to help you get through the journey in the best way possible. So reaching out for help and guidance when you think you need it. And you know what, this podcast kind of serves as that a little bit, doesn't it? I wish when I was starting out at the beginning of my science career that I knew the different steps of the tertiary education system. I wish I knew how to get a job afterwards. So just wanting to say a really big thank you to all three of our wonderful guests today for being part of this podcast and sort of imparting some of your wisdom and knowledge on how to get into the science career in New Zealand. And also thank you out there to the people listening. Please check out our SIS pages on our Plant and Food website for extra links and photos on the topics covered. And also please subscribe to our channel on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. And don't forget to post a review and rate this podcast. See you in the next one.